I'd ask you this evening to turn to Proverbs chapter 6. Proverbs chapter 6. I'm going to read some verses that we have time, and you've probably heard many messages from these verses, but it's something that we need to be reminded of from time to time, remain fresh in our minds. We're going to begin reading in verse 16. It says, "These 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination unto him, a proud look, lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, and heart that deviseth wicked imaginations, feet that be swift in running to mischief, a false witness that beareth lies, and he that soweth discord among brethren." These things are warnings. They're also that which are to make us alert to things that God hates. And it says, yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. So these are not just things that we pass off, not just things that we discount, but this is serious things. 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. So these are serious things, and we need to understand what God hates. 7 are an abomination. So what does it mean that God hates? You know, there are some people that we've run across in times past say God doesn't hate anything. Well, God does hate, but God's hatred is not like the hatred of man. God's hatred is a perfect hatred, and he names these things that he hates and that are also an abomination unto him. But in Deuteronomy, and we're going to be coming back here to Proverbs consistently, but in the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 16, we find here in verse 22, Deuteronomy 16, verse 22, says here, "Neither shalt thou set thee up any images which the Lord thy God hateth." So this is talking about idolatry. God hates idolatry. And adultery is a whole nother message. But we understand God hates idolatry. Why does God hate? Because when anyone practices idolatry, anyone who's practicing idolatry, they're putting that idol in the place of God. And God hates that. So these things here that we see in these verses are hates. And 7, hatred is an opposition to a behavior mentioned here in verses 17 through 19 that are against the attributes of God. Every one of these things in these 17 through 19, they are against God's attributes. God's attributes are pure and perfect. And as we look at examine these things, they're the opposite of God's perfect attributes. And as we look at them, as we go through them, we're gonna see that even if these things are committed against us, which many times they are unpleasant, and they are not all things God hates, are sins committed by any human being upon this earth. God hates sin. And all these things in these verses are sin. God hates sin. And no matter what kind of sin it is. And, you know, sometimes, and we've heard this during our life, probably have too, that, you know, there are gross sins, there's bad sins, and there's just horrible sins. People try to categorize sin. And just like they'll say, well, that's just a little white lie. You know, there's little sin. One sin is enough to send a soul to the depths of the hell for the eternity. One sin. God hates sin. And he says 7 things here are an abomination to him. So you say, what is an abomination? An abomination to God is an expressed disgust and hatred that bring a stench to him. In other words, he hates sin, but there are some sins that are an abomination. We live in today, in all the homosexuality and immorality, sexual immorality that's going on in this world, that's all an abomination to God. God hates them. They're a stench in His nostrils. All moral perversion is an abomination to God. Looking back in the book of Leviticus chapter 18, and we're not going to take the time to read all of this account here in chapters 18 and 19, but we'll just get a couple verses here in chapter 18 and then one in chapter 18, verse 22. It is an abomination. That is, and as we know from the book of Romans, he also mentions woman with woman. It's an abomination. They're trying to oppose diverse training. No, we don't need that training. They need biblical training. They need to be told the truth. They need to understand the truth, that that behavior is an abomination to God. And those who practice such, according to 1 Corinthians 6, cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven. In other words, if this is their practice, if this is their lifestyle, they cannot be saved in that condition. They can be saved out of it. In verse 30 here, Leviticus, therefore shall ye keep mine ordinances, that ye commit not any one of these abominable customs, which were committed before you, and that ye defile not yourself therein. I am the Lord your God. God is warning the Jews here not to commit any of these abominable acts that are covered in chapter. Look over in chapter 20 and verse 13. It says here, if a man also lie with mankind as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. So those who practice such, their blood is upon their own heads. But that's, we see, is an abomination before God. That describes the hatred that God has for such sin. Now let's examine these 7 things that us and heart that deviseth. Excuse me. I'm look back up in verse 17. It says a proud look. A proud look. To have a proud look. This is to examine oneself with your eyes upon another. In other words, what he's saying here is you look upon yourself, get up like in the morning, you look in the mirror, and you say, there's no that's greater than me, there's nobody better than me. In some cases, I've seen a few people like this in my life who have fair looks, good looks, whether both male and female, and they think that they are better. They're proud of their looks, and they look down upon everyone else because they aren't as good looking as they are. They the fine features they have. God says this is an abomination. He hates this. He hates here in Proverbs chapter 11, he says this, he says, when pride cometh, then cometh shame, but with the lowly is wisdom, but with pride cometh shame. In other words, eventually there's going to be shame. And I've seen individuals who have competed more or less for anyone to be, better looking than them, more beautiful than them, to be stronger than them, to be smarter than they are. But what Solomon tells us here in the 11th chapter, verse 2, is sooner or later that individual is going to come crashing down. But in the meantime, we see he hates this, and this is one of the 7 things that are an abomination. He says, goes on and he says, that shed innocent blood. Excuse me, myself here. A proud look, a lying tongue. A lying tongue. This is one who speaks, is to speak an untruth from their mouth, use their tongue about anything or anyone. And we knew a man when I was growing up. He was called the Windjammer, and he would just tell lies, stories, just to, in some cases, to get a rise out of something, or to put someone down. And he was called the Windjammer because most of the time we found out whatever he was talking about was just hot air. But God says he hates this. He hates a lying tongue. And it is aggravating to be around somebody that you cannot trust, that what they tell you to be truth. And it's kind of like the story of the little boy that cried wolf. Cry wolf enough times, and when the wolf comes, no one's going to believe you. Well, it's the same way with a lying tongue. If you speak lies long enough, no one's going to believe you, even when you tell them the truth. Looking back in Psalms 120, we find here Psalms 120 and verses 1 through 3. Says here, he says, my distress, I cried unto the Lord, and he heard me. Deliver my soul, O Lord, from lying lips and from a deceitful tongue. What shall be given unto thee, or what shall be done unto thee, thou false tongue? What's going to happen to you, you false tongue? What's going to happen to you that is a liar, who has trouble telling the truth? It's an abomination unto God. God hates it. So what's going to happen? Well, in some cases, those lies come back to haunt the individual. Still, when we look at it, God still says he hates it, and it's an abomination unto him. He goes on here, he says, and hands that shed innocent blood. Innocent blood. Any crime. And anymore, every time, but almost every time you turn on the news, you hear of innocent blood taken from them. And it's not just with firearms. On the news, they said that this is the worst year ever in Tennessee for pedestrians to be hit and killed. Hit with vehicles. There was a case just within the last week where there was 3 people. Now, again, they were out, closed down the bar, and were heading back to their car, and somebody come flying in the road that they were crossing and hit all 3 of them. Didn't kill any of them. But many cases, these pedestrians are being killed. Some, they're in places they shouldn't be. Others are innocently walking along the road. We've also seen where people are knifed to death. Someone wants to kill somebody, they don't have to have a weapon. We've heard within the last year where people were strangled to death. But at any rate, however one shed blood, God says it's an abomination unto him. In 1 Samuel chapter 19, 1 Samuel chapter 19, we find here in verses 1 through 5. Now this is when he didn't take his life, but this is when King Saul, life of David. We find here it says, and Saul spake to Jonathan his son, and to all his servants, that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, saying, Saul, my father, seeketh to kill thee. Now, pray thee, take heed to thyself until the morning, and abide and hide thyself. And I will go and stand be Father in the field where thou, and I will commune with of thee, and what I see, that will I tell thee. And Jonathan spake good of David unto Saul, and said unto him, let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he hath not sinned against thee, and because his works have been to thee word very good. For he did put his life in his hand, and slew the Philistines, and the Lord wrought a great salvation for all Israel. Thou sawest it, and didst rejoice. Therefore then wilt thou sin against innocent blood, to slay David without a cause? Jonathan pled, or made a plea, to save David's life. Saul sought it on more than one occasion. But we see there that he says, why shed innocent blood? David was innocent. David wasn't guilty there of sin against Saul. But to shed innocent in any time is an abomination before God. Any unjustified death of another shedding innocent blood. And there are many ways in which people shed innocent blood. I've often said, doesn't always tried that way, but anybody that commits armed robbery, if they don't ever pull the trigger, they believe they're guilty of attempted murder. Because why did they carry that weapon in there to rob? They intended to use it if they thought they needed to. But in shedding innocent blood, this is an abomination. He also says, a heart that deviseth wicked imagination. Are we living in a day when man devises wicked imaginations? To devise or to fabricate a planned evil intention against another for the purpose of doing them harm. That's what it means to devise wicked imagination. Plotting that which with the intentions of harming another individual. That doesn't just mean physical harm. This can mean harming their reputation, harming their ability in some cases to make a living, or harming their reputation, people to bring shame upon them. This is all a heart that deviseth wicked imaginations. And there are people, I believe today, in today's world, that just lie awake, thinking of how they can bring wicked imaginations against other individuals. In the book of Jeremiah, we find here in verse 17, Jeremiah 23 and verse 17 says, still unto them that despise thee, the Lord has said, yea, or ye shall have peace. And they say unto every one that walketh after the imagination of his own heart, no evil shall come upon you. Now in this portion, Jeremiah is talking about false prophets who are telling people, even though your wicked imagination sends you in the opposite direction of God, you're okay. No one's going to hold you. Well, God is. Man can try to justify it. But if God says it's sin, if God says it's wrong, if God hates it, if it's an abomination to God, it's going to remain that way. It says here, those that devise wicked imaginations. This is a common occurrence in today's world. From politics to the job sites to even family matters. There are families who have family members who will devise imaginations against others. And this is always a selfish motive to promote self, to advance self, to escape that many wrong things, devise wicked imaginations against others. He goes on, that be swift in running to mischief, a false witness with lies. That be swift in running to mischief. And we've all seen this happen too. This is anyone, they hear of a possibility of another involvement in sin, and they just have to run. This is kind of like gossips. Just have to run. Have to get involved. Know what's going on. To try to verify. I worked with a guy that was constantly doing stuff like this. He would hear on the other side of the plant that somebody said something or were doing something, and boy, he was there in a flash to try to find out what was going on and to expose the individual. He knew that they were such a wicked person. That is a person whose feet are swift to run to mischief. And we've seen other cases. Somebody hears a rumor that someone has said something or done something or is doing something, and boy, they're right there in the middle to try to find out try to get in the mix so that they can point a finger, so that they can accuse another person. They're swift. They're quick to do so. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 59 and verse 7, we see here the Bible says, their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed innocent blood. Their thoughts are thoughts of iniquity, wasting, and destruction are in their paths. And this describes those whose feet are swift to shed innocent blood. They just can't wait. Just can't wait to get in the mix of whatever is going on or whatever they think is going on. These folks are not happy unless they're involved in some kind of problem, kind of evil, some kind of accusations against another. He goes on, he says, a false witness that speaketh lies. Now, in court, all themselves, don't always get caught, but perjure themselves against another individual for the purpose of causing them harm. These are false witnesses that speak lies. And it's happened many, many times within churches also. There's seen individuals that aren't liked for some reason by other members, and you have these wicked people with the congregation who will try to against an individual for the purpose of trying to get them excluded from the body, or just causing problems, period. But false witnesses, many times we think about this in the court of law, where people will get on the witness stand and purposely perjure themselves to bring harm against another. Here in Proverbs chapter 19 and verse 5, first of all, he says, a false witness shall not be unpunished, and he that speaketh lies shall not escape. Verse 9 says, a false witness shall not be unpunished, and he that speaketh lies shall perish. A false witness that speaketh lies. Use their tongues in such a way, are trying to gain personal gain for themselves. They're trying to gain something personally. Well, maybe they want, in some cases, in some places, they want to get a promotion. I've seen this happen when I was in the Army. Guys would somebody who they thought was going to get promoted before them, so that they could try to get promoted ahead of the others. And we've seen it in workplaces, different places. But that's an abomination. God hates such. He says, and he that soweth discord among brethren. And this is a terrible thing. This, I believe, is talking specifically, we can apply it specifically unto church family. Those that soweth discord among the brethren, sowing false information to cause another harm or shame. That's what he's talking about here. In 2 Thessalonians in chapter 3, 2 Thessalonians in chapter 3, in times happen through the years. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 11, he says here, for we hear that there are some which walk among you disorderly, working not at all, but are busybodies. So a busybody is what would be described here as one that soweth discord amongst the brethren, in busybodies. In our lifetime, we've seen a lot of busybodies. But in these who are sowing discord, many times, and I want to tell you, sometimes you have to watch preachers, because they like to pass the gossip along the line. Man's deceased now, but every time I would talk to him on the phone, he would say, is there anything going on down your way that I need to know about? No, don't know a thing. Haven't heard a thing. But we don't need to hear. Yes, there are some things we need to know. For the most part, we don't need to know. But discord, sowing discord among the brethren, passing gossip along. That's what he's talking about here. It's a sin. It's an abomination unto God. And again, in 1 Timothy this time, 1 Timothy chapter 5, we see in verse 13, we find here that Paul writes, and withal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but tattlers also, and busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. What he's talking about here, of course, this is people who, basically younger women he's talking about here that are widowed. What he says is they need to find another husband, otherwise they're going to go around being busybodies. God hates such. It's an abomination to him. Such a person, they're miserable individuals. They're more than one way. They're miserable because of the things they say, but many times they're miserable within themselves because they haven't heard anything lately. They haven't picked up any gossip. They haven't picked up any idle words to pass. And we don't need to. Solomon mentions here is among brethren. In verse 19, false witness that spreadeth lies, and he that soweth discord among brethren. Again, is within churches of the Lord Jesus Christ many times of personal gain. Many times those who sow discord amongst brethren is for personal gain. God hates this. It's an abomination. Those who do such evil will in time reap what they sow. You know, we've heard that many times. They're going to reap what they sow, and they do many times. Many times. Bottom line is, the thing, these things he mentions here in these 3 verses, God hates, and they are an abomination unto him. They're a stench before God. And the last thing any of us should want to be, God. So we stop there tonight, stand and have a verse of song. Ask tonight if the Lord has spoken to you in any way. If there's anything you need to bring before us at this time, feel free to do so.